lunch. We talked about this quite a long time before we worked it out, and I'm actually flying to New York like tomorrow, so we just barely made it, but I'm happy to be here. How many of you have ever heard of the term inner source? Oh my God, that's so good. I've been on a crusade for the last 6 years to get people to think more about inner source and maybe even implement it. And I think I first talked about it at OSCON in 2015. But before that, of course, I had to convince my company that it was a good thing to do and all that. So you're going to hear a bit about inner source. You're going to hear, ooh, where'd the clicker go? Thank you. Hopefully that'll work, yeah. So who knows who this is? Anybody? Come on, he was born in Ireland, Killarney, in fact. That is Tim O'Reilly of O'Reilly Publishing. And he actually coined this term, inner source. He was on the board of a company called Collab.net, which was founded by the Apache co-founder Brian Behlendorf. And the reason that Collab.net existed was to help companies figure out how to use open source methods inside, because we thought it was a better way to develop software. Unfortunately, it was 1999 and 2000 and 2001, and the truth is open source hadn't won yet, so it was very easy for people who didn't think inner source was a good idea to rebuff it. You know, prove to me that this is a better way to build software, right? And so they pivoted. They still exist as a company, but they don't really do inner source anymore, which I think is a shame. But Tim did write a foreword to the book I'm going to show you in a minute. Who knows what the aerodynamic property of a bumblebee is? Anybody? Nope. They're not actually supposed to be able to fly. They're too heavy for the size of the wings. That's why they make so much noise when they, because they have to provide more lift. It's a complete anomaly. I'm here to tell you that 20 years ago, open source was that as well. Nobody believed it was going to take off. I mean, nobody. It's kind of a miracle to me, the extent to which it is pervasive now. When the term was coined, of course, free software had been going for a while. I want to be sure everybody knows that we completely acknowledge that. But Tim decided that the free part of free software was confusing in English because the word free means two things. It means no cost, and it also means free as in liberty. Free as in liberty is what Richard Stallman meant when he coined the term free software, but companies heard free as in gratis, and that was problematic. So the shift to the term open source was just about shifting the emphasis away from the cost of acquisition, because there were, at that time, believe it or not, a fair number of companies didn't want to touch it because anything free must not actually be very good, right? But lucky for us, open source won. This is the Win kid, and I use him all the time right now because I think he's really cute. Open source won, it's everywhere. I'm not going to quote Mark Andreessen because I think he gets quoted far too often, but we all know that, right? Is there anybody here who really hates open source? No? Great. One of the things that I have for you today, for the few of you who get down here, are hexagonal stickers that say open source is art, which I actually happen to believe. I think one of the things we have to change in order to keep open source evergreen and healthy is people have to start learning how to treat themselves as artists instead of cogs in a wheel. Because your company wants you to be a cog in the wheel. It's much easier if you're fungible resources. But open source people really aren't that way. We like to work on the stuff we like to work on, and we like to say if we think something isn't going to work and avoid the fail, right? And that makes us artists rather than machines. So, okay, so why do you think open source won? Anybody? I know it's early. I have free books for people who are compliant. Anybody? Why do you think open source won? Yeah. Yes, the Linux kernel was a huge part of it because it enabled people to move away from expensive proprietary implementations of Unix and also expensive proprietary hardware. Anybody else? Yeah. Very large developer community. I don't think anybody was prepared for how large a developer community we were going to build. I saw one back there, yeah? What? Bugs. Well, it is true. Eric Raymond said that many eyes make all bugs shallow, and that's kind of true. But then there's the other thing, which is Windows was the dominant platform. I mean, in the internet, maybe Solaris or Sun's OSs were dominant, but for most people that touch computers, they were wrestling with Windows. And Microsoft wasn't being very good about patches. But the patches for, say, Apache was patching in less than 24 hours most of the time. Now, whether or not that patch got applied to the server on your end, that's a different problem. But it was happening faster, and it seemed like there was a higher interest in quality. Anybody else? Yeah. Yes, there are definitely people that want to share, and along with that sharing thing comes this enlightened self-interest of open source. It makes you famous, and then you get a better job. Yeah? The cloud? I think open source won before the cloud, but if you mean that cloud companies used open source so pervasively and made it even more acceptable to commercial, that's true. Yeah? You? So? No lock-in. Yes, that's a huge one. I actually think that one of the drivers that people always miss in this conversation, because you guys all got really good ones, is that it's founded on co-opetition at the company end. That means instead of competing on every single step of the layer and only supposedly collaborating on open standards, we shifted to actually paying attention to collaboration and not reinventing the wheel every time. We agreed to cooperate with the competition on certain levels of the stack. And that agreement means that open source is good for business. As soon as open source became good for business, it was hard to stop it. Even Microsoft couldn't stop it, right? So that's important because open source is about to go through a major test. Does anybody know what that is? It was announced 2 days ago. No? Okay. The US Supreme Court has agreed to take on the final hearing on Oracle v. Google over Android. And that decision has come down 3 times so far in lower courts. Twice, Google won. Google said, or the judge said, this thing should be freely reimplementable. It's in open source. Even the API should be reimplementable. What's your problem, Oracle? That was the right answer. But Oracle was able to get their way in one court appeal. And because of that disparity and the value of this piece of software, the US Supreme Court is now going to listen to and decide whether or not open source APIs are reimplementable. Believe it or not. It could change everything if it goes wrong. So there's going to probably be a moment where regular developers are asked for their opinion about this. You guys know what to do, right? Hit Twitter, hit it hard. Say, this cannot happen. This is going to blow up all this productivity that this sector has enjoyed in the last, frankly, 20 years, 15 anyway, right? There would be no Google without this. There would be no Twitter without this. There would be, of course, lots of things, right? Okay, so lucky open source developers. How many of you guys actually contribute to open source projects, like check in code? Okay, these are the lucky guys. They got the bigger smiles. You can tell. But most developers are still stuck in the salt mines. They're still working the old-fashioned way. In a minute, I'm going to talk about some of the annoying things that causes. Inner source is meant to try to help with that, okay? So, for instance, silos. Many of you guys have too much specialization in your organizations, where very few people, one team, knows everything about a key piece of software that everybody else needs to hit. And then when you want to change something, you have to request a change and hope those guys actually pay attention to your request. That's really common, right? Yeah. All right. So believe it or not, inner source will help with this. Then, of course, there's the inevitable bottlenecks from excessive specialization and from some other old school practices where you spend more time sitting around than you want to because you're waiting for something and people are yelling at you. When I draw this for engineers, I usually draw the bosses as pieces of Swiss cheese and the cheeses are yelling at each other. I just ordered a cheese hat for my boss. Anyway. So, and then there's another problem that inner source gets at, which is too much sameness. And you might laugh about this because in Ireland, of course, we're going to all try to be a little different than each other, to distinguish yourself. But in, say, Germany, it might be really hard to figure out how to create innovation in your company. InnerSource has been successfully used for that. Just to pull people out of the everyday and let them work on what they actually want to work on, and not under the weight of all the rules and mores that are built into the engineering culture of older companies. And some of these companies are really old, And then, of course, there's a problem that you have to hire new recruits all the time. And the new recruits at this point are digital natives, which means they've always had digital availability. They've always had open source. There's always been high-quality open code available as far as they're concerned. But they don't understand the fight that went into making it win, and they are disinclined to fight for it because they don't understand that they have to, right? Also, when they come into your company, they won't stay very long if they feel encumbered by the process that your company normally engages in. They expect more collaboration than is sort of normal in the open source world, the non-open source world. And then, of course, there are companies who have acquired an implementation of GitHub Enterprise, hoping to get the InnerSource effect, but it doesn't actually magically happen. It's not if you build it, they will come. Just making the code open inside a company doesn't necessarily mean that you start having good characteristics of collaboration. So, yay, InnerSource. This is the InnerSource logo. That's the other set of stickers I have up here. So if you guys want to come up at the break, just until they're gone, take them away. So here's an example of a company, for those of you that didn't believe that this helps with innovation in certain kinds of companies. This is Bosch. Bosch is a massive company. They actually have something like 50,000 engineers. And they were all trained to work a certain way. But there was some concern in the R&D organization that they weren't getting much innovation out of that behavior. So they switched to using what they called BIOS, which is Bosch internal open source, because they didn't know that InnerSource existed as a term. This represents about 6 years of slowly scribing out and scaling their InnerSource practice. But this is all of the groups that collaborate across the company. This is their full stack knowledge. They can show you that it's happening, right? And that's huge in a company where they couldn't innovate something simple like an app that controls the thermostat on your house, right? Oh, how many of you have thermostats in your house? That's pretty good. In Ireland, it's more common to have a timer, which takes a while to get used to. And when I called my electrician and said that I wanted to change it to like a Nest, he said, oh, you'd have to pay for that now, wouldn't you? So, everybody's got a different thing. But Bosch actually got the self-parking car came out of that program, the software for that, which of course shows up in Audis and various other German-made cars. The thermostat thing that I mentioned before, they completely satisfied their senior management that the spend had been worth it based on new things they came up with. All right, how many of you have run Agile shops or do stand-ups every day? Yeah, because I'm in a DevOps room. For the record, I love Agile. I've worked in Agile companies. It's a very good way to organize work. It is not, however, a way to get startup culture to somehow flower in your older company. The truth is, most big old companies that adopt Agile end up doing WAGILE, which is waterfall Agile. Look at all the heads going, yeah. So Agile's good because it's convenient to do, the making sure everybody's aligned, short execution points, demos, those are all really good things. Co-location, that particular thing, don't do that. It's really expensive and it screws up your InnerSource because if everybody's in the same physical room, they're going to have mouth conversations and information is going to fall on the floor. All the people in the room are going to hear what's said, but it's not going to be memorialized. One of the great things about open source and one of the things you're trying to do when you do InnerSource is aggregating information that can later be indexed and searched and used as the real documentation that you need as a developer rather than whatever it is the team wrote in their documentation sprint day where they Of course, they're not going to tell you, sort of the underlying story because it's not always that pretty, right? All right. This is the best Oribus I could find. I spent some time looking at this DevOps, ellipsis thing, and I decided this was the best way to go. Here's the good news for people in DevOps about InnerSource. They play so nicely together because every company of a certain age has to implement CI and CD, from scratch. It's not like it's a just add water kind of thing because all that integration stuff has to fit within the existing culture of the product usually. So in fact, a lot of companies do it backwards. They do deployment first, and then they get people to work backwards to build their integrations, and they use InnerSource to make that happen. They'll do an exemplar of what integration looks like, and then with an API, and then let people write into it, right? So we're seeing CI and CD pushing InnerSource into companies a lot, really a lot, and that's a good reason for me to be here. By the way, when I was the CTO of Wikipedia, the CTO of Wikia, which was my sister company, was a guy named Arthur Bergman. Does anybody know who he is? He started a company called Fastly. So we had a group of people who had worked really, really hard to make our caching work for a wiki orientation, which means it has to be pretty short, right? The refresh rate has to be short because when people hit publish, they have to see their change actually hit the wiki. That's one of the intrinsic rewards of wikiness. We had that problem. We had heavily modified Squid to make that work. And we modified it in the direction that Varnish ended up going. So Varnish came out after Squid, and Arthur got in there and got interested in making Varnish work well for Wikia. And he got it working so well, in fact, that he went to Jimmy Wales and said, I'd like to start a company about this. And Jimmy said, yeah, knock yourself out. They just raised, a lot of money. Like Fastly is the thing. If you're looking for caching, go them. They know what they're doing, right? He also, and the reason I bothered telling you about him, the whole conversation about DevOps came out of Jacob from Chef and Arthur, then from Wikia, talking to Tim O'Reilly about how cool it would be if there was a meetup for people that did their job, and we're trying to fix that gap between development and operations. When I was at Wikipedia, I cared a lot about that gap because we had one single production instance and no sandbox. So when things changed in Wikipedia, they changed directly, And so I cared a lot about that. InnerSource would have been a good way for Wikipedia to work. Wikipedia is MediaWiki is an open source project, but it's not exactly run like a classic open source project because there are 150, 200 engineers who are paid by somebody to put stuff into it, and then there's everybody else, and there's like 10,000 everybody else's. So it's hard to scale it that way. It's similar to the way the Linux kernel works now, actually, but it was hard for us back then. All right, so in 2015, I also founded the InnerSource Commons. If you're a company that's interested in InnerSource, that maybe you were doing this when you were hearing about some of the things that it'll fix, this is a place where companies can go and have real conversations about how InnerSource works, what doesn't work, what mitigates problems. And it doesn't cost anything to join. It's just a Slack account. You just request one, and then you're in. And we love having people come to it and contribute. There's lots of interesting projects there. There's one that is to build tutorials. The tutorials are on Safari U, if you have a Safari U account, for free. But they're also on InnerSource Commons website itself. They're just not quite as nicely integrated, but all the material's there. We also have copies of all the books that have been written. We also have a pattern community that's identifying InnerSource patterns of behavior and mitigations that work with them. There's also an index to all the academic work. These are the 3 books that I just mentioned. The first 2 are pretty thin. This one is the first kind of comprehensive book about InnerSource. It was written with me and a guy from the University of Limerick. And I have 4 copies of it here that will go into the raffle materials. So if you have interest in this, you can also find it at InnerSource Commons in a PDF. So you can get one. You just might not get one that's signed and on paper. We also host through InterSource Commons a fair number of summits, InterSource summits. We just finished Summit 9, so we've been doing them twice a year for about 5 years. The next one is in April in Spain, and the information about it is on that other homepage that I showed you. And so that's the nearest, for a year in Europe. But then there's one in North America, probably actually in Canada this next time. And I'm doing the first one in India. So if you work for one of the large integrators and you think they need to learn this, trust me, they do. And the way that I know that they need to is because some governments now make it mandatory for taxpayer-paid software to be open source. France has this rule. So every time France writes software that's paid for with taxpayer dollars, it must be open source. But France doesn't have legions of developers that work directly for the country. So when they do a big project, they job out a lot of the engineering to one of the big integrators who doesn't know how to collaborate. So no open source really ever happens. No community ever develops around that code. We have to fix that, right? So I think that's maybe 20% of that 85% of people that never know how to do it. And of course, there's enormous turnover there. So we have to make it institutional in those companies that they understand how to collaborate with people that aren't on their payroll. This is all about making it possible to hire people that know how to do this already instead of building them from scratch, because open source developers at this point, again, are a small percentage. All right, I can take questions if you guys have any questions, and I'm very happy to talk about anything. Dara can say how long we have. Anybody? Ah, there's one back there. Sorry, he'll get to run around a bit.
How does InterSource work with regards to companies that have to have compliance in their workflows?
Right. Well, I started this at PayPal, which is a bank in Europe, so they definitely have compliance in their workflow. And they still were able to do a fair amount of InterSource. So I was leaving, they had about 25% penetration. They have 8,000 engineers, so that tells you they had about 2,000 engineers working in this way. Like Agile, like all this stuff, like CI/CD, in fact, none of these things are by themselves a panacea. It's a combination deal. But changing the culture in the direction of real code review, real mentorship so that locked up information gets passed on so you get full stack developers at the end of it, and something like meritocracy so that they know who's really doing the work, those were big enough values to PayPal that they obviously did not open their compliance code or their risk code to anybody reading it. It's on a separate system. I think that in the end, that will also slow them down because Google has almost all their code open. The only stuff that's not open is like admin keys and, encryption algorithms, that kind of thing. But they're within the company, anybody can contribute to anybody else's code or learn about it by reading. I think that's going to become the norm over time because we're dealing with an old idea of how security is created. Most malicious acts on software are done by disgruntled employees, right? Not by hackers or open source people or collaborating, in the clear. In the clear is a pretty safe place to work, actually. So anyway, I think they work around it in the most key places that they have to. I'm going to give a talk, 2 talks this month for Finos. Finos is a financial open source nonprofit that pushes into the financial markets, pushes open source use and understanding of open source. And lo and behold, they're all coming up with processes for how they're going to manage contribution back because they get it that they want to contribute upstream. They want to do it for optics because they're nice. They're supposedly nice guys, Goldman Sachs, but also they want to do it because they don't want to have to maintain and backport the changes that they've made if they're not secret sauce changes. So they've got these new processes and they're really tortured because of the compliance thing. But I saw the same thing happen in most companies that had versions of Unix that were being sold to the Department of Defense 15 years ago. And then everybody realized that that was a ridiculous level of paranoia, given that most of the people who find problems with your software are going to be from outside, not inside, and they're going to tell you about them. So anyway, I think it's possible. A lot of companies are doing it, and even whole industries that are heavily regulated are interested now. I went to a meeting in Paris a couple weeks ago that was about the energy grid for the world. What if the transforms for digital energy or renewable energy were written in a collective way instead of each of those grid operators having to custom write that change, right? Wouldn't that be better? I think it would. So they're getting used to the idea. It's definitely not a simple thing because it requires culture shift, and culture shift is hard. Anybody else? I think we got time for one or two more. Oh, come on. Really? Oh, there's one. Sure. So in InnerSource, let's say you're doing regular work, and you're in a regular siloed company where there's specialization, and you're on one edge of the company, and you need to get a change in one of the core silos. You send a feature request, and you wait, and you wait, and you wait. And eventually, your boss yells at you because you're not done yet. And you explain what's going on. You can show them the timestamp. I've been waiting. So then they call their counterpart over on the other side of the company who eventually gooses their people so that you get your thing, right? But you didn't learn anything in that process except, that waiting is part of the process. But what if instead you could see everybody's code, you could submit a pull request. Let's say it's a tiny change. If you could read the code, you could submit a pull request. And if there was somebody there waiting to catch the pull requests, who I call a trusted committer, it's somebody who really knows that stack and has commit privileges, moreover, is willing to take responsibility for code they didn't write themselves, right? There's somebody there that's waiting to catch that patch. They look at it. They go, oh, I see that you did a good job, but you used a method that's going to fall over at scale. We didn't document that. I'm so sorry. They send that note back to you, right? So you do what they ask you to do. You use some other method, send it again. It gets picked up. Let's say that whole process took you 2 days instead of however long, a whole sprint sometimes to get somebody to pay attention to the fact that you sent a feature request. You just learned something about that silo. In fact, you could run around and learn about all the silos and how to get inputs in and out of them, and that would make you a more valuable engineer in your company. That's InnerSource. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay, I think maybe we have one more time, but you guys have to decide fast that you want to ask a question. And, whoops. No? How many of you people think that this is a little iffy and it's never going to happen? It's okay, you don't have to hurt my feelings. How many of you people really want this to happen? Because it would make your lives so much easier. Yeah, that's right. So I actually came to this because I worked at Apple, that bastion of there is nothing. You can get fired at Apple for telling the person who sits next to you what you're working on. Like it's the anti-InnerSource. I got locked out of necessary code trees as an engineering manager by another faction in the company that was mad at our guys. We were writing what is now called FaceTime. They didn't like that we were teaching QuickTime to work on the internet. They wanted to make it work really well on one Mac and sell bigger and bigger Macs, and they thought we were wasting their time. Of course, we won, right? Now, 20 years later, the kid that did that, he was 16 years old. Do you guys know the guy that invented QuickTime was 16 when he did it? And an employee of Apple? Anyway, that's part of why I got locked out, because he was a kid and he didn't understand about collaboration. He employed me 15 years ago to teach him how to do collaboration because he needed it. And he tells his friends that he taught me open source by being such a punk. So, so I just want to fix it for everybody, and I got to go because the lady in the back is going to come with the big hook in a second here. Thank you so much for your time.